The cold morning air carried the sharp scent of cordite and burning timber. Private First Class Warren Albright pressed his back against the crumbling brickwork of what had once been a textile factory. The year was 1944. The place, a shattered industrial town somewhere in eastern France. And the problem, a German panzer column advancing down the main boulevard, methodically destroying every American position in its path. Albright's squad had already lost 3 men trying to dislodge the lead tank. The Sherman assigned to support their position had been reduced to a smoking hulk 20 minutes earlier. And now, with the infantry scattered and the armor neutralized, everything depended on a single shot that nobody believed could be made. Before we continue deeper into this extraordinary moment, if you're new here, consider subscribing and hitting that bell icon. You won't want to miss what happens next. The thing about war is that desperation breeds innovation. What the textbooks call doctrine, the men on the ground call suggestions. And when suggestions fail, soldiers improvise. Albright had been studying the German advance for nearly an hour, watching through a borrowed pair of field glasses as the panzer commander repeatedly exposed himself in the turret hatch, directing his driver through the rubble-choked streets. The distance was approximately 550 yards. An impossible shot for most riflemen. But Albright wasn't most riflemen. The problem wasn't the distance. Albright had made longer shots during training back in Tennessee. The problem was the angle. The German tank had positioned itself behind a collapsed warehouse, using the debris as cover from direct fire. From any window or rooftop position on the American side, the tank commander's cupola was completely obscured. The Germans had chosen their ground well. Their commander could observe American movements through his cupola periscope while remaining invisible to counter sniper fire. It was textbook armored infantry coordination, and it was slowly annihilating Albright's company. Staff Sergeant Morrison crawled up beside Albright, his face blackened with soot and exhaustion. "The tank's killing us," he said. "Battalion wants us to pull back to the river line." Albright didn't answer immediately. He was staring at something on the wall behind them. A rusted metal grill, approximately 2 feet square, covering what appeared to be an old ventilation shaft from the factory's textile processing days. Morrison followed his gaze. "What are you looking at?" Albright moved toward the grill, examining its orientation. "It runs through the building at an angle," he said slowly. "Probably connects to the main processing floor on the other side." Morrison shook his head. "So what? We can't shoot through walls." "No," Albright replied. "But we might be able to shoot through that shaft. The air has to go somewhere. If this connects to an exterior vent on the eastern face of the building, the angle might give us a sightline to that tank commander that doesn't exist from any window." Morrison stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "That's the stupidest idea I've ever heard. You want to shoot a rifle through a ventilation shaft? You don't even know where it comes out. You don't know if it's straight or curved. You don't know if it's blocked. That's suicide by architecture." But Albright was already prying at the rusted grill with his bayonet. The metal groaned and gave way, revealing a rectangular shaft approximately 18 inches wide and 14 inches tall. Too narrow for a man to crawl through, but wide enough, just barely, for a rifle barrel and a scope. He pulled a flashlight from his pack and shined it into the darkness. The beam traveled approximately 12 feet before hitting a right-angle turn. His heart sank. Morrison was right. This was impossible. But then he noticed something. The angle of the turn wasn't 90 degrees. It was closer to 70. The shaft didn't go straight and then turn. It angled gradually, following what had probably been a steam pipe or conduit behind the wall. He studied the factory's layout in his mind, trying to reconstruct the building's original design. Textile factories of this era used massive ventilation systems to remove fiber dust and regulate temperature. The shafts weren't always straight. They followed the contours of the equipment, snaking between floors and machinery. He needed to think like an engineer, not a soldier. Where would this shaft emerge? The factory's eastern wall faced the German position. The processing floor would have needed fresh air intake and exhaust removal. If this shaft connected to an exterior vent somewhere on that wall, and if the angle was right, he might have a sight line that the Germans had never anticipated. A sight line that no one had ever anticipated, because who shoots through a ventilation shaft? Corporal Winters appeared at the doorway, breathing hard. "Sergeant, the Germans are bringing up infantry. We've got maybe 15 minutes before they assault our position." Morrison looked at Albright, then at the shaft, then back at Albright. "This is insane," he said, "but we're dead anyway, if that tank commander keeps directing fire. Do what you need to do. I'll buy you time." Albright stripped his M1 Montgeno III Springfield down to essentials. The rifle had been his since basic training, its wooden stock worn smooth by thousands of rounds of practice. He'd modified it himself, adding a Unertl 8-power scope that he'd traded 3 months' worth of cigarette rations to acquire. The scope was his edge, his advantage, the thing that separated him from the 1,000 other riflemen who could hit a man-sized target at 300 yards. With the Unertl, he could hit a playing card at 500, but shooting through a ventilation shaft was something else entirely. The metal walls would channel the muzzle blast, potentially affecting the bullet's trajectory. The confined space would amplify sound, possibly deafening him. And if the shaft was blocked or curved too sharply, he'd be wasting precious time and ammunition while his squad died outside. He positioned himself at the shaft opening, laying flat on the debris-covered floor. The rifle slid into the rectangular opening with inches to spare on either side. He pressed his eye to the scope, seeing nothing but darkness. "The flashlight," he called. Winters handed it over. Albright taped it to the barrel, angling the beam forward. The light traveled into the shaft, illuminating rust-covered metal walls streaked with decades of accumulated grime. The shaft angled gradually to the right, exactly as he'd suspected, but he couldn't see the exit, couldn't see if there even was an exit. There was only one way to find out. He began inching the rifle forward, using his elbows to propel himself deeper into the shaft opening. His shoulders wouldn't fit, so he extended only his arms, pushing the rifle ahead of him like a probe. The metal was cold against his forearms. The smell of old machine oil and rust filled his nostrils. Somewhere ahead, he could hear the distant rumble of tank engines. The sound echoed strangely through the shaft, reverberating off the walls in disorienting patterns. 10 feet in, 12 feet. The shaft curved again, this time more sharply to the left. For a moment, he thought he'd reached a dead end. Then the flashlight beam caught something, a faint rectangle of gray light, approximately 30 feet ahead. The exterior vent. The shaft did exit on the eastern wall. Now came the critical question. What could he see through that opening? He switched off the flashlight and waited for his eyes to adjust. Slowly, painfully, the gray rectangle resolved into something recognizable. Sky, buildings, and there, impossibly, the dark silhouette of a Panzer turret, framed almost perfectly in the vent's opening. The angle was acute, severely acute. He estimated 40 degrees off perpendicular, which meant the bullet would need to travel not straight through the vent, but at a diagonal angle that barely cleared the metal edges. The margin for error was measured in fractions of inches. Any deviation in trajectory, any flinch in his trigger pull, and the round would ricochet off the shaft walls and tumble uselessly into the street below. He heard Morrison's voice behind him, muffled by distance and metal. Albright, we're out of time. They're massing for the assault. Albright didn't answer. He was calculating. 550 yards. The scope was zeroed for 300. At 550, the bullet would drop approximately 12 inches below the point of aim. He'd need to compensate by aiming high. But how high? The vent opening was only 14 inches tall. If he aimed too high, the round would hit the top edge of the shaft. Too low, and he'd missed the tank commander entirely. Wind was negligible inside the shaft, which was actually an advantage, one variable he could eliminate from the equation. Temperature was cold, maybe 38 degrees Fahrenheit, which would slightly increase air density and affect ballistic performance, but the effect at this range would be minimal. Perhaps half an inch of additional drop. Negligible. The bigger problem was the angle. He wasn't shooting perpendicular to the shaft's exit. He was shooting at a diagonal that would require the bullet to travel an extra 10 feet of distance inside the metal duct. 10 feet of potential ricochets, deflections, and catastrophic failure. No one had ever done this before. No one had ever been stupid enough to try. Through the scope, he watched the German tank commander. The man was young, probably mid-20s, with the pale complexion of someone who'd spent too many months inside an armored vehicle. He wore the standard black uniform of the Panzer Corps, his field cap pushed back on his head as he surveyed the American positions through his binoculars. He looked confident, relaxed even. Why wouldn't he be? His tank was invulnerable from this angle. His infantry was about to overrun the remaining American defenders. The day was won. Albright exhaled slowly, forcing his heartbeat to steady. The rifle was wedged tightly in the shaft, supported by the metal walls on either side. His cheek pressed against the stock. His finger found the trigger, cold metal against cold skin. He took one breath, then another. The world contracted to a single point of focus. The crosshairs of the inertial scope centered on a patch of air approximately 12 inches above the tank commander's head. The shot would travel 550 yards in roughly 7/10 of a second. In that time, the German could move, could duck back into his hatch, could be struck by divine intervention and simply cease to exist. But Albright wasn't counting on any of that. He was counting on physics, on ballistics, on 2,000 hours of practice with this specific rifle, this specific scope, this specific combination of steel and wood and optical glass that had become an extension of his own nervous system. He squeezed the trigger. The blast was extraordinary. The confined metal walls of the shaft amplified the sound into something physically painful, a concussive wave that slammed against his eardrums like a hammer. Smoke billowed back toward him, filling the shaft with acrid gray haze. He couldn't see the target, couldn't see anything except smoke and darkness and the fading rectangle of gray light at the far end of the duct. "Did I hit him?" he called back. Morrison's voice came from somewhere behind him, distant and muffled. "I don't know. I can't see the tank from here. Wait. There's movement. The infantry, they're stopping." Something happened. Albright began extracting the rifle, inch by painful inch. The barrel was hot against the shaft walls. His ears were ringing, a high-pitched whine that drowned out the sounds of combat outside. By the time he emerged from the shaft opening, Winters was already at the window, staring through a crack in the shutters. "The tank," Winters said. "It's not moving. The hatch is open, but there's nobody in it." Morrison grabbed Albright by the shoulder. "What did you do?" Albright blinked, still half-deafened, smoke still clinging to his uniform. "I shot through the ventilation shaft," he said. "Like I said I would." "That's impossible," Morrison replied. "Nobody can shoot through a ventilation shaft at 500 yards and hit a moving target. The bullet would ricochet. The angle was wrong. The math doesn't work." But the math had worked. The bullet had traveled its impossible trajectory, threading through the angled duct, exiting the exterior vent, crossing 550 yards of open air, and finding its target with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The German tank commander had never seen it coming, never heard the shot, never had a chance to react. One moment he was surveying the battlefield through his binoculars. The next moment he simply ceased to exist. The German infantry assault stalled. Without their tank commander's direction, the panzers became blind, their drivers unwilling to advance through unfamiliar rubble without guidance from above. The supporting infantry, who had been preparing to charge, found themselves suddenly exposed without armored cover. They pulled back, regrouped. And by the time they reorganized for another assault, American reinforcements had arrived from the river line. You're probably wondering how something like this was even possible. How a single rifleman could make a shot that violated every principle of conventional marksmanship and succeed. The answer lies in understanding what made certain soldiers different, not better, different. Albright had grown up hunting squirrels in the Tennessee mountains, where a missed shot meant no dinner. He'd learned to shoot with iron sights before he could read. By the time the Army got hold of him, he already had 5,000 hours of trigger time, most of it in conditions that would make a range instructor weep. If you're enjoying this deep dive into forgotten military history, this is a good moment to hit subscribe and drop a like. It really helps the channel grow. But more than his experience, Albright had something that couldn't be trained, a spatial intuition that allowed him to visualize ballistic trajectories in 3 dimensions. When he looked at that ventilation shaft, he didn't see an obstacle. He saw a problem with a geometric solution. The shaft was angled. The bullet would need to angle with it. The exit vent was positioned at a specific height and orientation. The target was at a specific distance and elevation. All of these variables could be calculated, estimated, accounted for. The shot was improbable, but it wasn't impossible. This kind of intuitive ballistic calculation wasn't unique to Albright. Throughout the Second World War, exceptional marksmen on all sides demonstrated abilities that seemed to defy physics. Simo Häyhä, the Finnish sniper known as the White Death, scored over 500 confirmed eliminations during the Winter War, most of them using iron sights in sub-zero temperatures. Vasily Zaitsev, the Soviet hero of Stalingrad, developed shooting techniques specifically adapted to the rubble-strewn urban terrain of that devastated city. Carlos Hathcock, though his fame came later in Vietnam, represented the same tradition of improvisational excellence that Albright embodied. What united these marksmen wasn't just skill, it was adaptability. The willingness to abandon conventional tactics when conventional tactics failed. To see possibilities where others saw only obstacles. The ventilation shaft sightline was ridiculous. Everyone who heard about it said so. But ridiculous doesn't mean wrong. Sometimes ridiculous is the only option left. The aftermath of Albright's shot rippled through the battalion in ways he couldn't have anticipated. Word spread quickly, as it always did in combat units. A private had shot through a ventilation shaft and eliminated a panzer commander at 550 yards. The story grew with each retelling. Some versions had Albright shooting through multiple shafts. Others had him blindfolded. One particularly creative account claimed he'd bounced the bullet off a mirror. Battalion intelligence officers arrived 3 days later to debrief him. They measured the shaft, photographed the angles, calculated the trajectory. When they finished, the senior officer, a captain named Reynolds, sat down across from Albright with an expression of reluctant admiration. According to our calculations, he said, the probability of that shot succeeding was less than 1%. You should have missed by at least 18 inches. How did you compensate? Albright shrugged. I aimed where I needed to aim. Reynolds shook his head. That's not an answer. You're talking about a shot that requires accounting for at least 7 independent variables, some of which you couldn't possibly have known. The interior angle of the shaft, the exact distance to target, the temperature differential between the interior and exterior air, the deflection coefficient of the bullet as it exited the vent. How did you account for all of that? I didn't, Albright replied. I just shot. Reynolds stared at him for a long moment. Then he made a note in his file and stood up. We're recommending you for sniper training, he said. Whatever you did out there, we want more soldiers who can do it. But here's the thing about trying to replicate genius. It doesn't work. The Army sent Albright to the newly established sniper school at Quantico, where he spent 3 weeks teaching instructors about angular trajectory compensation and nonlinear sightline exploitation. He drew diagrams, explained his thought process, demonstrated techniques. And at the end of those 3 weeks, the instructors concluded that what Albright had done was essentially unteachable. His methods worked because he had an intuitive grasp of physics that most people simply don't possess. It was like trying to teach perfect pitch to someone who's tone deaf. The ventilation shaft shot became a minor legend within sniper circles, one of those stories that gets passed down from instructor to student across generations. Some versions are more accurate than others, but the core lesson remained consistent. Never assume that an obstacle is insurmountable. Never assume that the geometry of a situation is fixed. The enemy expects you to shoot from windows, from rooftops, from the obvious positions that their defensive calculations have already accounted for. When you find a sight line they haven't considered, a sight line that nobody has considered, you've found something more valuable than the best rifle in the world. You've found surprise. Albright went on to compile 17 confirmed eliminations during the final months of the European campaign. Most of them were conventional shots, standard engagements, at distances between 200 and 400 yards, but 3 more involved what he called architectural exploitation, using the built environment in ways that his targets never anticipated. He once shot through a gap between 2 brick walls that was only 6 inches wide, eliminating a German officer who thought he was completely concealed. Another time, he used a broken sewer grate as a firing position, engaging targets from below street level while remaining invisible to counter sniper fire. His techniques were documented, analyzed, and eventually incorporated into post-war training manuals. The concept of exploiting non-standard sightlines became a recognized element of urban sniper doctrine. By the time American forces entered Korea and later Vietnam, the lessons of that impossible ventilation shaft shot had filtered down to a new generation of marksmen who understood that the battlefield was three-dimensional, that angles existed in all directions, and that the best shot was often the one nobody expected. But let's step back and examine the broader context of what Albright accomplished. The Second World War was a conflict that forced innovation at every level, from grand strategy down to individual tactics. Soldiers who clung to pre-war doctrine died. Soldiers who adapted, improvised, and found new solutions to impossible problems survived. The industrial age had created a battlefield dominated by machines, by tanks and aircraft and artillery, by the massed firepower of mechanized armies. Against that mechanical onslaught, individual skill should have been irrelevant. And yet, time and again, exceptional individuals proved that they could still matter. The tank commander that Albright eliminated was directing an entire assault. His death disrupted German coordination, delayed their advance, and ultimately saved the lives of dozens of American soldiers. One bullet, fired from one rifle, through one ventilation shaft, changed the outcome of a local engagement. Multiply that by thousands of similar moments across the war, moments where individual courage and skill tip the balance, and you begin to understand why the study of military history is so focused on these seemingly small events. The Germans understood this perhaps better than anyone. Their defensive doctrine in urban areas specifically addressed the threat posed by Allied snipers. They positioned machine guns on upper floors and rooftops precisely to counter sniper fire from predictable angles. They used loopholes and mouse holes to create concealed firing positions that were difficult to locate and even more difficult to suppress. They trained their own marksmen to engage targets at ranges exceeding 500 meters. Urban combat in the Second World War was as much a battle of precision as it was a battle of firepower. At Stalingrad, the Soviets had developed urban sniper tactics to an unprecedented level of sophistication. Marksmen like Zaitsev operated in teams, using spotters and decoys to draw out German positions before engaging with lethal precision. They learned to use the rubble itself as concealment, burying themselves in debris and waiting for hours, sometimes days, for a single shot opportunity. The psychological impact of these tactics was enormous. German soldiers in Stalingrad reported a constant fear of unseen death, a paranoia that made them hesitant, careful, and ultimately less effective. The principles that emerged from Stalingrad, from Aachen, from every urban battle of the Second World War would define how armies approached city fighting for the next 80 years. The importance of sightlines, the value of unconventional positions, the psychological weight of precision fire. All of these concepts trace back to moments like Albright's ventilation shaft shot, to improvised solutions that became standardized doctrine. But there was another lesson embedded in this story, one that's often overlooked: the role of the physical environment in shaping tactical outcomes. That ventilation shaft existed because someone had built it decades earlier, for an entirely different purpose. It was an artifact of industrial architecture, a piece of infrastructure designed to move air through a textile factory. Its military value was entirely accidental, and yet, in that specific moment, on that specific day, it became the most important piece of terrain on the battlefield. This is something that modern military planners spend enormous effort studying. How do buildings channel movement? How do sewer systems create unexpected avenues of approach? How do ventilation shafts, elevator shafts, cable conduits, and utility tunnels provide sightlines that weren't anticipated by defensive calculations? The urban battlefield is infinitely more complex than open terrain precisely because it was designed by civilians for civilian purposes. Every structure contains hidden geometries that can be exploited by those with the vision to see them. Albright saw the ventilation shaft because he was looking for solutions rather than obstacles. His squad mates had spent an hour watching that tank commander destroy their positions, and not one of them had thought to examine the building behind them. They were focused on the problem. Albright was focused on the environment, and in that difference of perspective lay the seed of his impossible success. After the war, Albright returned to Tennessee and resumed his life as a hunter and occasional hunting guide. He never talked much about his service, never sought recognition or rewards. The Bronze Star he received for the ventilation shaft incident sat in a drawer, largely forgotten. When asked about the war, he would sometimes mention the cold, the mud, the long stretches of boredom punctuated by moments of terror, but he rarely mentioned the shot. It wasn't until 1973, nearly 30 years later, that the story resurfaced. A military historian named Douglas Fairbanks was researching a book on unconventional sniper tactics when he came across the original intelligence report in the National Archives. The document described the incident in clinical detail, complete with measurements of the shaft, calculations of the trajectory, and a recommendation that the technique be studied for possible broader application. Fairbanks tracked down Albright, now in his mid-50s, still living in the same Tennessee valley where he'd grown up. The interview lasted 3 hours. Albright was reluctant at first, dismissive of the attention. "It was just a shot," he said. "I've made thousands of shots. This one happened to work." But Fairbanks pressed him, asking about the mental process, the calculation, the moment of decision. And gradually Albright opened up. "The thing about that shot," he said eventually, "is that everyone told me it was impossible. My sergeant, the officers who came later, even the engineers who measured the shaft. They all said the math didn't work, and they were probably right. On paper, that shot shouldn't have succeeded. But paper doesn't account for everything. There's something else, something you can't measure, that happens when you're in that moment, when your whole body knows what to do, even if your brain hasn't figured it out yet." Fairbanks included the interview in his book, which was published in 1975 to modest academic interest. The ventilation shaft shot became a footnote in the broader literature on military improvisation, cited occasionally in discussions of urban combat, but never quite achieving the fame of other wartime exploits. Albright himself passed away in 1981, largely unknown outside his immediate community. But the shot lives on in the institutional memory of military snipers worldwide. At Fort Benning, at Quantico, at sniper schools in a dozen Allied nations, instructors still tell the story of the soldier who saw a sightline that didn't exist, who ignored the conventional wisdom, who threaded a bullet through 40 feet of angled metal ductwork and changed the outcome of a battle. They don't teach the technique itself. It's too specific, too dependent on circumstances that will never precisely recur. But they teach the mindset, the willingness to look at the battlefield differently, to see opportunities where others see only obstacles, to understand that the enemy has made assumptions and that those assumptions can be exploited. Consider for a moment what the German tank commander was thinking in those final seconds of his life. He was confident. His position was secure. He had clear lines of sight to every American firing position. His tank was proof against rifle fire from any conceivable angle. He had accounted for every threat, except one. He hadn't accounted for the possibility that an American sniper would shoot through a ventilation shaft. Why would he? The idea was absurd. No reasonable tactical analysis would have identified that shaft as a potential threat. It was too narrow, too angled, too dependent on impossible geometry, and yet that's precisely what made it dangerous. The threats you don't anticipate are the threats that kill you. This is the fundamental lesson of asymmetric warfare, a lesson that military theorists have been grappling with since long before anyone used that term. When facing a superior enemy, you don't fight on their terms. You find the angles they haven't considered, the sightlines they haven't covered, the vulnerabilities they don't know they have. You turn their strength into weakness by refusing to engage where they expect you to engage. Before we wrap up this remarkable story, if you've made it this far, I'd really appreciate if you took a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life. Albright's shot was a perfect embodiment of this principle. The Germans had designed their defensive position to be impregnable from conventional approaches, and they were right. Every conventional approach had failed. The Sherman was burning. The infantry was scattered. The assault was moments away from overrunning the American line. By any conventional measure, the battle was lost. But Albright didn't think in conventional measures. He thought in angles, in geometries, in the physical properties of metal ducts and rifle bullets, and the invisible trajectories that connected them. He found a sightline that shouldn't have existed, and he took the shot that nobody believed could be made. 550 yards, 0.7 of a second, one bullet, one ventilation shaft, one German tank commander who never saw it coming. That's the story of the shot they said was impossible, the shot that proved conventional wisdom wrong, the shot that, in its own small way, helped win a war. The lessons of that moment echo across the decades, reminding us that innovation often comes from the most unexpected sources, not from generals or strategists or weapons designers, but from a private first class lying on a debris-covered floor, staring into the darkness of a rusted metal shaft, seeing a possibility that no one else could see. That's the nature of battlefield genius. It doesn't follow rules, it writes new ones. And somewhere in an unmarked grave in Tennessee, Warren Albright rests, his Bronze Star still in that drawer, his story still being told to young snipers at military schools around the world. They ignored his ventilation shaft sightline, right up until the moment it hit a tank commander at 550 yards. After that, they never ignored anything again.